Guys, yeah, so I'll off video. Not okay.
You can share screen if you haven't.
Yeah, I'm sharing here.
Logical time.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Yep.
Great. Okay, yeah, so one second. Let me just open up something here. Okay. I have my notes on a separate screen.
I'll be back in a minute.
Okay, so thank you all. My name is Dennis. I'm the +1 of the virtual cell. And about 10 years ago, I met Gabriel and another friend of ours named Surgeon at graduate school. And we started a group to study Lacan. And I think one of the best parts of being asked to speak about logical time here is that it's also an opportunity to kind of contemplate the origins of our reading group and the kind of problems that we were trying to study at the time, because the whole idea or the notion of logical time is very much related to not knowing what you're doing as you're doing it. Right, that's a common theme throughout psychoanalysis, from Freud to Lacan and onward. But yeah, logical time is a kind of a formal way of describing this not knowing what you're doing as you're doing it, but then being able to look back and assert something about, this is what I was doing all along. And so, yeah, when I think back 10 years ago in the time that I was studying Lacan with Gabriel and Surgeon, I have that feeling, of, oh, okay, this is what we were actually trying to do. And what we were actually trying to do was to understand the relationship between psychoanalysis, which seems like a very personal, individual process, right? You go to analysis, you talk about yourself, and it's a very private thing. It appears, but what we were interested in is, okay, there is this very private thing, this thing that you cannot really share with anyone except your analyst, right? It's a very singular experience. But how is it possible that something of that experience can be used to educate and to bring together a group of people? I think this is one of the biggest, say, paradoxes or interesting points about challenges about psychoanalysis, which is, you have a very private thing that, you even cannot describe it outside of analysis, because part of the analytic situation is that you have this, rule of free association in place, and you have a specific relationship with your analyst that you cannot just have with anyone. So how does that get translated or brought into something like a political project, for example? So when I look back onto Pensée, I think this is what we were very much interested in, and that is why we spent so much time trying to understand this text by Lacan. So yeah, I just say all this as a preface to the actual text, but it's really nice to be able to look back and try to trace that path, because I think the circle is a big part of this question. I think Pensée was also very kind of a short-lived thing. Surgeon, myself, and Gabriel, we read most of Lacan's text, but then there was a certain moment where we felt like the group wasn't really working anymore, but we wanted to somehow generalize it, and we wanted to ask a further question, which was, can we bring this to anyone, right? can this challenge of understanding Lacan or reading go beyond just reading Lacan and also incorporate other things, maybe more political concerns. So, so I think, yeah, the problems of logical time and the circle are very closely related. So I would be open to having a discussion about that at some point in this presentation, probably near the end. Yeah. So anyway, let's go to the topics. So first, I'm going to give some historical, history about the text itself and why Lacan wrote it. And then we'll actually go into the text, both the sophism and its solution. And I did some formalism here in the solution, but don't be scared. It's very minimal and actually not completely necessary to the understanding. But we can also discuss, like this formalism, because I haven't really shown this before. And I think, there might require some tweaks because it's still fairly new. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the idea of collectivity that this sophism implies, because it's a very counterintuitive or very, different kind of collectivity, right? It's a logical collectivity, whereas normally we think of collectivity or politics in general as being kind of, driven by these kind of conflicts or power, for example, like a very common theme whenever we talk about groups of people trying to achieve something. As we talk about power, we talk about incentives. And in a lot of ways, it boils down to a very economic view of collectivity. So I wanted to show how Lacan's logic can challenge that view of the economic side of collectivity. Maybe there's another side to it that by looking closely at this sophism, we can kind of draw some consequences out of that in that sphere. Okay, so context. So the primary, I would say, inspiration, or the what I think to be one of the most important points to consider is that Lacan writes Logical Time at the end of World War II. So this is like a huge, obviously, moment in history. So many some of these problems include, just general apathy, but a lot of it would be what we call today like PTSD, right? War trauma and neuroses. So Bion was put in charge of this hospital and needed to find a way to help these men. So he came up with a hypothesis, which was that in order to cure group neurosis, you needed to introduce something like a wartime discipline. So he thought, it's not about him curing each individual person, but rather creating an atmosphere where these men could cure themselves, essentially, by adopting the discipline of a soldier again. So he wanted to create this environment of being a soldier within the hospital. So he devised an experiment, and then you can see the rules of the experiment. So everyone must do 1 hour of training, physical training. and then you must be part of at least one group. And if you wanted to, I left this out, but you had to choose your own profession or your own job within the group. And if the group did not exist, you had to form your own group. And if you could not attend your group meetings, then you would be sent to the nurse, right? And it would be kind of you would be kind of isolated from the rest of the group. You'd just be sent away. And then every day there was a meeting with everyone in every group to have kind of an open discussion on what was happening, their progress and whatever issues might come up. So if we look at this experiment, already we see some of the same kind of innovations that we have in the circle, which is kind of this very loose structure. In the circle, we don't specify what it is that you study necessarily or what it is that you do within the circle. We only ask that members form groups and then kind of self-govern those groups. And then there can be discussions about the tasks that you do within each group. So I think that's very, already this experiment has a really novel or unique aspect. Okay, so here are the results of that experiment. So in the first case, people were very apathetic. They didn't want to participate. They formed the groups because they had to. It was a requirement, but it was not taken seriously. And they would even form groups to kind of rebel against the system. Like they formed a dancing group, and it was kind of a way to mock the process. Like, these soldiers were saying, look, we will make any kind of group, we want, and not really taking it seriously. But of course, Bion was, being an analyst, he could spot the acting out of the soldiers very easily. So he, said, okay, well, if you want to have a dancing group, then you need to make sure that you train properly and you're actually learning to dance. And so he, put them to task on the things that they said they wanted to do. So at first there wasn't much enthusiasm there, but then at some point he announces to everyone, okay, well, I've heard that the soldiers in this room have all complained at one point in time about the structure of the army and how the army is so stifling. They don't let you do what you want to do, or the army is very not very efficient, and the ways of organizing are just not very good. Like, they could do better, right? So Bion tells them, you always complain about how the army is structured. So here's your chance to structure it differently. If you have a better way, then show me. I want to see your form of organization. So after he announces this, we enter into the second phase, where now people are actually trying to take it seriously. Several of the men become very active in their groups. They start to, improve the daily routine of the hospital. So that's things like, even the food, improving the food there, improving the cleaning, the hygiene and the cleanliness of the hospital, and as a small group of these men are working so hard to, follow the experiment, I guess, they start to complain because, okay, there's 20% of the group is working hard, and then 80% is kind of just getting the benefit of being part of the experiment, but not really participating, right? They had an issue with lack of participation. And so I mean, that's again an issue that sometimes we face in the circle. This idea that we make plans to do things, but then we often see that only a small group of us actually do the hard work, and then the rest of us maybe contribute a little bit at points, but it's very rare to see everyone participating at once in most of our projects, right? There's this kind of you can even see the ratio 80-20 is a common thing, not just in the circle, but any kind of organization, especially if it gets bigger. So instead of punishing the 80% that are not working, he suggests, okay, this is a wider problem than just this hospital. And if you want to get these 80% to work, you need to come up with ways to engage them. So he's telling this to the 20%, right, that are working hard. So then this leads us to the final phase, which is about, this whole thing took about 6 weeks, the whole experiment. So after about a month, he saw a dramatic change in the functioning of these groups. They became very efficient. Then there was a lot more work than time to finish it, because the experiment only ran during a certain set number of hours per day. But even then, the groups were starting to operate outside of these hours, because members became so engaged in their tasks. And he noticed that both the patients and the medical officers had a shared sense of accomplishment, right? It was this feeling of being part of something, part of a project, or part of a collective effort. So that's pretty much the entire experiment. And he wrote about this in his text, which I can send after the meeting's over. But it's a very nice text where he talks about his ideas about discipline and how groups basically regulate themselves according to a leader. And you can see, given he has training both in being a soldier, but also in being a psychoanalyst. So he has this kind of unique perspective on what being a leader means. And even in this experiment, the entire point of these, the entire point of these groups that were formed was that anyone could be the leader, right? It wasn't a strict hierarchy that you normally would find in the army. It was, if you start your own group, then you are the leader of that group. It's just from sheer practicality, you have to make things happen on your own. And so this experience of, allowing these prisoners to, sorry, I say prisoners because the next part is about prisoners, but allowing these soldiers to govern themselves. I think this experiment shows us a lot about what psychoanalysis is capable of on the level of groups. Lacan writes the text Logical Time in the same year that two important things happen. One is this experiment by Bion in the UK. And the other thing that's really important that's happening at this time is in the United States, there was some of the biggest strikes in history, in the United States history. I think somewhere between 5 to 10 million workers were striking across the country. And this had to do with kind of all the soldiers coming back from the war, and a lot of because in the United States you had during the war, women were asked to basically take up the tasks, the workload in the factories and so on that were left behind by the men who were sent off to war. So when the men came back, there was a big shift in the society as far as joblessness. There was a lot of these strikes were about minimum wage and social benefits and so on. So there's this big wave of strikes, and at the same time, the government passed this act called the Taft-Hartley Act, which it basically limited the power of unions, right? Because these strikes were done by unions, and part of this act was to create what's called the right to work laws in various states. At least this act allowed states to create right to work laws, and a right to work law is basically how do you say, optional, to make membership into a union optional. And this was a very crippling law for unions, because part of the power of a union is that everyone belongs there. So if you have a strike, you kind of you have this solidarity between all the workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you make the union membership optional, you get a problem, because a small group of union members will still be fighting for benefits that will help all the workers, but there's less and less incentive for you as a worker to join that strike, right? Because I can just go to work as normal while everyone else in the union is fighting, and if the union succeeds, it's great because I get the benefits. But if the union fails, that's okay. I'm still going to work, right? So by creating this law that's called the right to work, we are basically effectively destroying the solidarity of unions. And actually, even today, we have a similar type of struggle happening in the United States. Just to connect it to contemporary issues, we have this thing about Medicare for all, right? Which is basically a single payer healthcare. Like I know in Brazil you have this nationalized healthcare, right? In the U.S. we don't have that, but we're trying to create that, and it's one of the big arguments against it is, well, we want choice, right? If you make everyone join this single payer healthcare, then we won't have a choice of which insurance we can get, and everyone will be under the same insurance, and that's bad because we want more choice. But again, it's the same principle. If you allow some people to not be a part of it, right? Like it's optional to have this healthcare. If you're healthy, you don't need to pay for this healthcare. Well, then there's the whole system would not work, right? Because you would have only a small number of people who need it fighting for it, and they can't support themselves. It's kind of one of those things that needs everyone to be a part of it for it to work. And the same thing in this union situation. Okay, so this is also happening at the same time that, and I'll talk more about this Taft-Hartley Act in the last slide. But yeah, this is happening at the same time that Lacan is writing Logical Time. And then also Lacan visits Bion and Rickman, who is another analyst working with Bion in this project. And he visits them on a study trip in England right after the war ends. And he writes a text on it in 1947, where he reflects upon what he experienced, visiting them in this, discussing this experiment that I was just showing you. So I'll read this quote here by Lacan. He says, "From my first approach until the end of my 5-week stay, this expectation of finding a different atmosphere was not disappointed. And it is in the guise of psychological evidence that I was able to discover this truth, that the British victory is of a moral order, by which I mean that the intrepidity of its people rests upon a veridical relation to the real, something that its utilitarian ideology does not easily convey. So what Lacan witnessed in this, we could say it's his interpretation of the experiment in the hospital, is that there is a moral victory that happened in Britain. And without that, you could not find a cure for this wartime neuroses. You couldn't get through the war. And simply reading it through a utilitarian lens, which, you know, the British are famous for being very utilitarian in their worldview. But if you just simply look at something like the experiment, this experiment from the first slide, and you look at the effects of that experiment, you could not really make sense of it if you simply read it through the utilitarian lens. So it's a nice comment here, and I think this text is a really good one to read if you want to learn more about Lacan's relationship to this experiment, because it heavily influenced him. So two more points of note in the timeline. One is Lacan would eventually go on to found his own school, the École Freudienne, Paris, right? And this school was in response to a lot of different things. For example, I mean, he was kind of kicked out of the organization that he founded previously, and he left the hospital that he was once having his seminars at, and instead he had to move to a more like academic setting. Right before, he was always giving seminars to other analysts, right, doctors and so on, and Saint Anne. But then at some point, Lacan founds this school and starts to give more, let's say, popular lectures. Although he still insists that he is speaking to psychoanalysts, he's addressing psychoanalysts, but he's, you know, his audience is now a much wider range of different intellectuals and students and so on. But one remarkable aspect of his school is that it's formed in small groups, right, which Lacan calls cartels. Cartels are groups of around 4 people, 4 analysts in various stages of their training, who come together to study one concept, let's say. And, you know, one of these members is called the plus one, and it has a lot of resonance to Bion's experiment. Yeah, and so I think it's nice to look at, you know, 20 years later, after he visits post-war Britain, he's still inspired by what he saw, what he experienced in that, you know, in that earlier experiment, and he borrows it and uses it heavily in his own school. And then the final point here is in 1966, he edits Logical Time for inclusion in his Écrit. So that's the version that is most well known as the edited version. I don't actually know, you know, if there is an English translation of the original Logical Time text from 1945. The one in Écrit is the one that's most widely read, in at least in the English world. Okay, so that's some context. Okay, now we can finally go to the actual sophism. Okay, so sophism is basically like a story, right? It's a lesson in a story. So there are 3 prisoners who are brought into a room, and they are told there are 3 white and 2 black discs in total. And some discs are put on each of these prisoners' backs. And they can only see the discs of the other prisoners, but they cannot see their own disc, right? Because it's on his back. And in reality, all 3 of them have white discs. Okay, so the black discs are not being used at all. Each of them has a white disc, and they can only see the other 2 having white discs. And they're told this when they have deduced the color of the disc on their back, they can leave. But when they leave, they have to announce the color of their disc, and they have to announce how they came to this conclusion. How did they reason their way to realizing that they have the white disc? Okay, this is the challenge. This is the whole puzzle for the prisoners. So, before I go to the next slide, it's a bit tricky, but we can already think about what is a possible solution to this, right? Because it's at this point we can say it's a simple game of combinations. So let's say I see 2 white discs in front of me, right? Because I'm one of the prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
I have either a white disc or a black disc on my back.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really only 2 combinations, right? White, 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 and white, white, black. I'm the black, right? How would you decide which one is the, which combination it is?
He cannot ask the questions, right?
Yes, that's important. Yeah, no communication.
No question, no communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he can only, for example, if he might be wrong, right? The prisoner who is, for example, he thinks that his is black, right? The others are 2. It can be illogical, but how, if he can explain his reasoning, how can I put it? So it doesn't matter what color, maybe I'm announce correctly. The first person to exit the room. Announce correctly the room. Mm-hmm. Let me proceed to the door. So probably no one will proceed to the door in a way. The 3 of them will have to, well, my first idea was that exactly like a sophism, because he can tell whatever he wants, whatever reasons. He might have read some classical work or something, and he starts, he starts beating about the bush and somehow coming up with this non-true. Yeah, but in this case, the first person to announce correctly their color. Yeah, okay, so he cannot be released. So I think they'll stay, the 3 of them. Max, what do you think? The 3 of them, because it's really, like you said, Dennis, it can be, there are 2, 50-50. I can be right and I can be wrong. So, and as I cannot ask any questions, then there is no way for me to know, and I cannot communicate to them. So I cannot come up with the right, I don't know, Max, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I thought in the same way. I would, I don't know, I thought in the same way, 50% for each of the last engineers.
Yeah.
Me and the other. Okay, so it's very difficult because it's like you must how can I say? I forgot the word in English. Like when you must it's like you must to roll the dice. Okay?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Like a gamble or statistically, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I really don't know how it's possible to sort this. Okay,
Yeah.
without inquiring on this. Well, I think that yeah,
And it's
I really don't
important,
know.
Yeah.
that is also thought because it's not only announced correctly, because then what Max said, it's like the roll of a dice. Okay, it's 50-50. I take the, but I will have to give my reasoning, right?
Yes,
And
that's important. Yeah.
because okay, and the dice is dice. Sometimes we um, we can. It's like, you know, guys. If you see, for example, we don't know something, and we see two strong men, or it can be even women. I don't know, anyone or woman and a man. You know, embracing very very strongly. So basically, it's like this 50-50. It can be a wrestling lesson, or the hugging, you know.
Yeah.
They're hugging, so there is love there. Or it's wrestling, right? So a strong wrestling that, and I think it is, if we see how are we, and without knowing what's going on, how are we going to explain, right? To announce, and okay, this is my reasoning. I think, okay, if I know that these are professional wrestlers, or for example, I see some muscles, or not even this, but I know something beyond from what I see, then I can say, okay, my reasoning, I know that it's a wrestling practice. But if not, how do I know? See?
Yes, exactly. It's very like it doesn't make intuitive sense because you don't have enough information, right? It seems like it's impossible to solve. And also, I think it's interesting to think about the kind of the motivation for the other prisoners. Like, what are they thinking right now? When I'm trying to figure out my my color, you know, they're also trying to figure out their color, but we can't communicate. So there is a kind of like we're kind of in the same
Both.
we're in the same boat, yeah, right. And this is actually the key to solving it, which is to think, okay, they're different from me, but they're also the same because they have to solve this problem too, and they also want to leave the prison. And so there's this aspect of the other, and then what is the other thinking, right? That is how we can try to solve this. So in the text, huh?
No, I think I remember the answer, but no, you can.
Yeah, sure. You want to say it, or
Please, Alex.
yeah,
No,
Alex.
No, I don't remember the answer specific, but no.
Okay.
No, so I remember you. We have 3 of one, 2 of the black. So
Yes,
so
3 white, 2 blacks. Yeah.
I remember there's the fifth level of thinking now, because if you the 3 guys there, acho que eu entendi o que eu going to say. So if one of the guys see 2 black discs, because you know I remember the fifth level of thinking. So if one of the guys have 2 black discs, because the others know what they have, but not their own. If they see someone with 2, they can go off because they know also there's 2 black discs. So if I see 2 black discs, or the guys with the 2 black discs, então, so I have a white one, so I can go. I remember that's the fifth level of thinking. So you want to do that? Can I do it to the end? I think I remember more. Because I
but
remember the answer.
everyone is with a white disk, isn't it?
Yeah, everyone has white, so you only see white.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a white disk, but I know that the two of my partners are with white disk.
White discs, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
That's for sure.
Oh, they can have a black eye, white still.
No. Yeah, but that's the point, Alex, because two discs are white. So there's no way for me. If they were black, then it's so easy, right? Is just
No.
but it.
No, if you see the other guys wanna have black, that's the second level thinking, and you're going the right way. I'm spoiling the whole thing, but
so you're saying if there were two black discs, then you would know immediately.
Yes.
Sure.
But
yes.
if
but
there were two, yes.
White.
But it's not actually the case that there's two. But yes,
No.
You're kind of assuming this would happen if in a different, let's say, counterfactual thinking, right? Like a different situation. Yeah. Yes, I think you're on the right. You're basically on the right direction, Alex. I'll show it now so we don't take too much time on it. But I think it's exactly what you're saying here, because the Lacan basically entertains the solution here, but he says there's some problems with it. Let's go through it and see. Hopefully this is clear. So he divides the prisoners into three: A, B, and C. Okay, A is really the one who is thinking. Okay, let's just pretend you are A, and you will say, if I were black, right? Because I can be, right? I can either be white or black. If I were black, then what are the other two prisoners seeing? The other two prisoners see a black and a white, right? Then the other prisoners will think, well, if I were black, right? Because they cannot see their own disc, but they see a black and a white. So they say, if I were black, then C would know he is white and leave immediately. And the same thing, C, who is this third prisoner, would also see a white and a black, and C would say, oh, if I were black, then B would know he's white and leave immediately, right? So B and C already have an extra information now. B and C are saying, if I'm black, then the other one will know immediately. But if they don't leave immediately, that must be because I'm white. So B and C will know again, starting from the beginning, if A thinks he's black and B and C do not leave immediately, A must be white. Because if they saw me as black, then they have some extra information, so they can figure out that they are white.
So basically we're saying here that my decision, or just looking that not living, my decision hinges on their not living. So that's why, judging by their not living, I can see that mine is white. In this case, A, right? Looking at B and C not living, then I know that mine cannot be black, because if he's white, if I look at B, right, and I see that his is white, and I see at C that is white, I would know that B is not living if mine, okay, the one is white, right? It has to be of the same color. So mine cannot be exactly what you said. So would know he's white and leave immediately if I were black. Yeah, that's what you, makes sense.
Yeah, if A were black, so A thinks if I were black, then B could say if I were black, then C C would leave immediately. It's no problem.
Mm-hmm.
So then B is looking at C, right? B is looking at C and saying, okay, is he leaving? Oh, he's not leaving. So I must be white.
Mm-hmm.
And then B would leave immediately.
Oh, okay.
B would go. And then same thing for C. C would say, C would be looking at B and waiting for B to move. If B doesn't move, then C would say, I must be white also. So then B and C would both go because they figured out they were white. And A would still be black here. But B and C would know, oh, okay, I'm white, and leave. But since they both don't leave, then A must be white, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is what Lacan calls the perfect solution. But it's used in a kind of ironic way because he finds a lot of problems with this solution. Mainly, it's not so much a problem, but it's an ambiguity in the solution. Can anyone spot that? Like, what do you guys think is the ambiguous part of this reasoning or the problem in this reasoning?
Oh, he's assuming.
Well, I'm gonna have a bit of time to understand more clearly this case.
Yeah, yeah.
I think for now we can carry on.
Okay, so in this case, what Lacan says or spots as being kind of the ambiguous part here is the word immediately. When we say someone should leave immediately and they did not leave immediately, how do we know how long immediate is, right?
Yeah, he's assuming.
We're assuming like we know what that is. What is it? 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 1 minute, 10 minutes? How do we know that they left? If they start to walk away, is that because they left immediately or because they had to think a long time? And, there is a kind of a variable time there. Like we don't know what is immediate. It could be 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 minutes, and 1 hour, right? So that's something that you normally in a logical problem, we never have this kind of, in traditional logic, you don't take time into account like this. And when you do take time into account, it's usually because there's some fixed number associated to this time, right? A unit of time. But in this sophism, we don't know the unit of time. We don't know what is meant by immediate. So this is the first issue, right? So here's some objections. First is hesitation is the evidence, right? If you see someone hesitating, then you have evidence that you are white. However, if they start to move, the evidence disappears, right? Because I need them to not move to know that I am white. If they start to move, then I don't have any reason to know that I'm white because then they've already left, right? So there's this problem there where your knowledge about yourself is based on the other not acting. So Lacan answers this by saying, okay, but there can be a second hesitation, which doesn't seem to make sense because we already said hesitation is ambiguous, right? We don't know how long does hesitation qualify as hesitation. But Lacan says, okay, once you start walking, you will see the others also hesitate again, a second time. And that's how you will know that everyone is white. Because let's say you had a black disc and you started moving thinking that you're a white disc because you saw them hesitate the first time. So you said, okay, I must be a white disc because they did not go immediately. So I will go and say that I have a white disc. But then you start to see them moving with you, the other two prisoners are walking with you, then you start to doubt if you actually have the white disc, because they're moving too, right? The evidence for your moving is based on them not moving. So Lacan says, oh, but then when you hesitate, they will also. At the same time, all three, because the three prisoners are the same in this logical manner. Okay, so his claim here is that when you see the second hesitation, then you know for sure I must have a white disc. Okay, so we can discuss that more. It's a kind of I would say the confusing part of the text is what is the second hesitation? But I think what's interesting here is Lacan says that this two hesitations can transform this problem into what he calls a temporal problem rather than a spatial problem. And this is something that he refers to many times throughout his teachings. After this text, he talks about spatial logic versus temporal logic. And I think this is the key contribution, the key concept in this text is what is a temporal logic. So we're going to go more into detail into this temporal logic now. So Lacan says, okay, how do we fix this problem in the perfect solution? Well, we need to start to take time as a logical element of the solution. Time must be included. So he starts with a simple observation, which is if you see two black discs, then you know you're a white. You have a white disc. Right? He starts with this assumption. And then he says, I wrote here, that the combination black, black, white is not possible because A sees two whites, right? And this is a spatial fact available to everyone. All three prisoners know that black, black, white is impossible because they see two whites, so there cannot be two black discs, right? However, this fact takes no time to realize. This is the important point, is that I know it takes zero time to know that there cannot be two blacks and one white. Okay, so I wrote a formalism here. Okay, assuming the letter P is the one who is thinking, T is the function that tells us how long a thought takes. And then the thought itself, what is being thought is this, saying, if I see two blacks, then I must be white. That's what this says here, right? This is what I see. I see two blacks. And therefore, P, which is the one who is thinking, equals W, white. Okay, so this thought is basically this part here, being opposite two blacks, one knows that one is a white. That's what this statement says. So we will say the instant of the glance is the formula that assigns to this thought the number 0, right? We know that this thought will take no time because it's an obvious fact. If you see two blacks, you must be a white. And that takes no time to think of, right? Okay. Okay, so then we go to the next step. So now we can say, were I a black, the two whites that I see would waste no time realizing they are whites. Okay, so here A assumes that he is wearing a black disc. So B and C must see a black and a white, right? The other two guys, they see a black and a white. now they're thinking. Okay, they're meditating on what they see. So Lacan calls this the time of meditation. And this is the time it takes to realize that I am a white if I see a black and a white.
Mm-hmm.
So remember here, it's if I see two blacks, then I know I'm a white, and that takes 0 time.
Mm-hmm.
Right, in the previous section,
Mm-hmm.
instant of the glance.
Time of a glance. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Here, you have a slightly different one. You see, if I see a black and a white, how long does it take to realize that I'm a white? That's what this T means. It means like, how long does it take to realize this? Okay, but before we know what that is, we have to realize that in order to know that this is true, that seeing a black and a white means that I am a white, we have to take into account the instant of the glance, which is this one here, right? We have to know this first to even answer the other one. Right? So there is a slight difference between this one and the other one, the instant of the glance, which is that this one, the time of meditation, requires the instant of the glance to solve it. And there's a different time because I need to take into account how long the other person will take to figure out the instant of the glance. We have a different amount of time. So I wrote this here. So the first term is the instant of the glance, which was from the previous slide. That's this idea that seeing two blacks means I'm a white, and that takes 0 time. But knowing this to be true, I can then say, if somebody sees a black and a white, then they will know they're a white, and that this whole thought will take less than some term A. We don't know what A is. It's just a variable. It could be, like before we said, it could be 5 seconds, it could be 10 seconds, or 10 minutes, you know. And then the entire time, this entire term is basically saying, how long does it take for me to know all this, everything inside of here?
This A, it's like is exactly this instance of the glance. Is that?
No. So instant of the glance is 0.
Oh, it's 0. Oh, okay.
Instant of the glance is 0, but the A is instant of the glance plus this new term, which is the time of meditation.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that time would, it's like time gives me an information.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that. Like
yeah, yes. The fact that
the key of interpretation is like that. The time informs me something, gives me an information.
Yes.
For me to take my decision. Is that right?
Yeah. It's the time it takes to know that because it takes no time at all to realize in the case of seeing two blacks, I must be a white. That takes 0 time. Therefore, if I see a black and a white, then it will take a little more than 0 time, possibly, to know that I'm a white, because I have to look at the other person and say, they must know, assume that I am black and I see a black and a white. Then I'm sure that the white, the guy wearing the white, will see 2 blacks and be able to go immediately.
Mm-hmm.
But because he doesn't immediately go, then I know I must be a white.
Okay, okay.
So the A is immediate. A is how long is immediate? I'm waiting for him to move.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm waiting for him to move, but I don't know how long I can wait, right? I could wait, again, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 5 minutes. I could sit there and wait and say, okay, he hasn't moved yet. So that must mean I'm a white. But how long is that time? We don't know how long that time is. So I just wrote the letter A to represent what we don't know, which is how long we should wait. Right. The other person, everyone, actually all three prisoners know this is true. They know that 2 blacks means I'm a white, and that takes 0 time. Everyone knows that. But only one person can do this, which is if I have a black disc and somebody else has a black disc, then it's the third prisoner that can make this judgment. Only the third prisoner, the one wearing the white disc, can do this, because they will see a black and a white. Sorry, no, sorry. No, that's not true. The third prisoner is the one who sees this. The one who sees 2 blacks is the third prisoner. I'm the one that sees a black and a white. So I can, seeing a black and a white, I must wait some amount of time before I realize, okay, it's time for me to move, because the other person didn't immediately move. Okay. So the A is just, what does it mean to be immediate move, not moving, right? Okay. So that's step 2, and then step 3. I hasten to declare myself a white, so that these whites, whom I consider in this way, do not precede me in recognizing themselves for what they are. Okay, this is the most complicated part of the thing, I think. So it's another set of formulas, but it's basically saying, let's review. Okay, so far, we know if somebody sees a black and a white, it's going to take them a amount of time to realize they're white. Right? Before we said if you see this, it's 0. Easy, right? Now we're saying, okay, if I see this, it's A. Right? Does that make sense? That seeing this, a black and a white, you cannot move immediately, because you still need to wait for the other person to see that they're not moving before you can decide, okay, it is time for me to move. So this is a little more than 0, but we don't know how much more. Okay. So then Lacan says, okay, but we know that A can be any term at all, right? It can be any amount of time, and we can actually make it as small as we want, right? Like if we think about like a variable, we can give it any time, 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3 seconds, right? We can count down. So we could even say that this A can vanish. A can become 0, because there's no necessity for A to be a specific number. Okay, so what happens here? If A becomes 0, if A is equal to 0, then this statement here takes the same amount of time as the instant of the glance. And then this creates a problem, because remember that everything is happening in the mind of A, the prisoner A, right? Prisoner A now realizes he is in danger of being behind the others, because he had to realize all 3 steps. But in order to realize all 3 steps, he must have taken more than 0 time. It wasn't immediate for him, right? Because he had to think about everyone's, what is the other person thinking that the other person is thinking, and so on. So he took some time to imagine this scenario. So this is what this long formula represents. This whole thing means this is from A's perspective. And really, I could write a here because it actually means, let me see here. Just 1 second, I can add that to this to make it a little simpler. I refresh. Yeah.
Take your time, my friend. I'm writing here.
See if this makes more sense. I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if this makes it clearer for you, but so I put an A here to show that this is how long it takes for A to think this thought. So this is a thought.
Okay.
And T of A means it takes A some amount of time to think this thought. And up here we have T, B or C, meaning this is a thought. This inside this parenthesis here, this is a thought, and it takes B and C some amount of time to think this thought, which we call A. Right? So B and C take A amount of time to think this, and A is taking some amount of time to think all of this. But the problem is that the amount of time that A is taking to think this whole thing, it can be greater than this amount of time, right? Because we said A is a hesitation. We don't know how long the hesitation is. It could be 0. The hesitation could be instant, very fast. So then A is starting to worry because he is thinking a more complicated thought. This thought is more complicated because it includes this thought, right? This is the second term in A's thought. So A is saying, oh, okay, I came up with this whole thing, but now I realize they could have realized something before me. So that's the important point in this section. It's the inequality between what A is thinking and what B and C are thinking, right? So A must conclude that he is white, but it's not because A is sure. A is not certain that he is white, but he's put in a strange situation. A has to assert that he is white because if he does not assert it, he will lose the chance to assert it later on. So Lacan calls this assertive logic. It's a different kind of logic than a normal, the classical logic. It has a syllogism like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? That's the very from the premises, you have some premises like all men are mortal, then you say, okay, therefore, if you add those facts together, you must get a new fact, something like that, right? Or you replace the specific man, Socrates can be put into all men. So that's regular logic, but this assertive logic is different. Assertive logic says I have to declare something, because if I don't declare it now, then I will lose the chance to declare it.
Okay.
So Lacan says that this is the ontological form of anxiety. So it's a strange idea to say that, anxiety, which we normally consider to be like a personal feeling or a personal affect, is somehow Lacan is saying that this is actually a logical thing, right? You have anxiety because if you don't do this thing now, you lose your chance, right? In this sense of anxiety, right? The ontological anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he goes further. Lacan says this is the origin of what he calls the personal form of the subject, as opposed to the impersonal form of the subject in step 1 and what he calls the undefined reciprocal subject in step 2. So again, the steps meaning, this is step 1.
Mm-hmm.
He says it's personal, or sorry, impersonal. And you can see that because it says one knows that one is white. So I'm not saying I know here. I'm saying one knows here. So it's impersonal. Then this is the undefined reciprocal. The reason it's reciprocal is because there's two characters, B and C, who both think this at the same time. Were I black, the two whites that I see would waste no time realizing they are whites. So then, because B and C would have this thought, because B and C are seeing black and white.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a reciprocal. And then the third one is the personal subject. This is the first time we say, I declare myself a white.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he says that this is how his theory of the subject appears in this moment, in this text. So that's kind of a strange way to introduce that. The idea of a subject has been, it's a long tradition of starting from, you could say starting from Plato, but Descartes famously has the Cartesian subject, that is to say, I think, therefore I am. It's a solution to a problem that Descartes had, which was the Cartesian doubt, saying, okay, what if God were trying to play a trick on me and everything that I perceive through my senses is a lie? Right? We have that even in the modern day. People ask about, what if we live in a simulation? What if, it's like everything's an illusion? This is a form of Cartesian doubt, right? And Descartes' solution to that doubt is to say, well, even if everything's a lie, the fact that someone tried to trick me, the fact that I'm here to be tricked, that I can be tricked at all, proves that I must exist. Because how else can I be tricked? How else can I be deceived if I didn't exist?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in exactly a similar form, it has this doubting and then asserting, because I'm doubting, because that in direct response to that doubt, I acquire my certainty. There's something like that going on here as well with this ontological anxiety. There's a doubt, about how long it's going to take to know that I have a white disk. I have that doubt, and then I have to, in order to overcome that doubt, I have to assert something about myself. So we have what Lacan calls the verification and objectification phase of this. He says there is what he calls a temporal tension, which is the cause for the subject to appear in the act of assertion. What is this tension? The tension is the hypothesis that P equals B, which means I have a black disk. And if I have a black disk, then basically I will be behind the others because the others will have an advantage over me. I will be lagging behind them. So in order to overcome this tension, this anxiety that I have that maybe I'm behind the others, I'm going to assert that I actually have a white disk. Yeah, and actually should be W here. P equals W. Let me see. P equals that here. Okay. Yeah. So once A asserts P equals W, then it's okay. It's now I have I don't have an advantage, but I am equal, at least equal to the other two, because I saw that they have white disks. So if I say I also have a white disk, I'm no longer behind them. I'm on the same level. But actually, it took some hesitation to realize this, right? So the tension in the first part, which is what Lacan calls a temporal tension, this becomes a hesitation. It's A's own hesitation. Mm-hmm. And we know that A, B, and C is actually just like kind of a formal way to describe the prisoners. All three prisoners are A, because all three prisoners are thinking the same thing. Mm-hmm. So actually A's hesitation is the hesitation of all three prisoners. And then, okay, so then all three prisoners start to walk towards the door. And then that's when you have the doubt again, because when I start walking to the door and I see everyone else is walking to the door, then I have to ask myself, well, are the others walking to the door because they saw that I have a black disk and they're just now realizing that they have a white disk, so that, my assertion was wrong, right? It's possible because, again, we don't know the value of A in this thing. So it could be that when they start walking that they actually are still thinking this. And they just realized, okay, they're white here. Yeah. So the first hesitation is not enough. We need a second hesitation, because then that confirms to me that, the others must be thinking the same thing as me. They must be thinking this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? If you are thinking this, T, B, or C, then you only need to hesitate one time, which is the A. That's the only hesitation you need to solve the problem. But if you're like me, if you're like the prisoner A, then you must think this entire formula. And because you have to think that entire formula, you have to hesitate twice. A second hesitation is required to confirm that this assertion, this P equals W, is correct. And Lacan compares this to the cogito, where you start with a doubt and then you achieve some kind of objective certainty. But it's a bit different because it takes time into account, whereas Descartes doesn't have a notion of like some amount of time he needed to, it's not like the subject needed to assert, I think therefore I exist now, or I think 5 seconds and therefore I exist, right? Because there's no need for temporal logic there. But in the case of Lacan and these prisoners, we have a kind of problem of common knowledge, that there's something shared between these three prisoners, something about the situation they are in, which forces the time to become a relevant variable. Okay. And yeah, this is where the last part of the presentation, basically, what is this something in common between the prisoners that allows us to use this logic? So I wrote here, the prisoners had to rely on a temporal common measure, which is derived from their common uncertainty. Right at the beginning, we were asking, okay, how can we know that I have a white disc? I cannot be sure, right? It's like you guys said, it's 50-50. It's a statistically or like a throw of the dice. There's no certainty about what disc I have, but that is what is in common between all three of us. So because it's in common between the three of us, Lacan says that you can turn this common uncertainty and turn it into a common time. And this transformation between this uncertainty to some temporal measure, this is the whole point of his logic, I think.
So there's no logical solution, but the solution is subjective.
Yeah, but for Lacan, it's not a contradiction to say it's logical and subjective. It's both logical and subjective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's not classical logic, right? He calls it the logical notion of collectivity. Mm-hmm. So it's a different kind of logic. And then he says this thing: the collective is nothing but the subject of the individual.
No, so he gets a solution, but the solution still can be wrong.
No, because his solution, because of the second hesitation, it must be right.
But his hesitation was the hesitation of the others.
Yeah.
No.
By the second hesitation, for sure that the other two are just like you. Because if they were different from you, they would only hesitate once.
Mm.
But because they hesitate twice, they must be like you. That's the transformation, right? You took something that was uncertain and you changed it into two hesitations. And because you can count them, you say like first hesitation, okay, it's over. Now the second hesitation, now I know for sure that I must have a white disc. That it is some kind of magic happening there, but Lacan claims that it's completely logical. It's not like he made it happen. It's just that's the form of logic.
Some kind of evil ritual.
Yeah.
I thought here, Dennis. I don't know if you can help me because it's a great effort for me to understand this principally Lacan. But I think it's I don't know if it's a closed way when Alain Badiou on Bain and Event, for example, says about like a bet. So I think we are talking. Well, it's exactly that. When the mathematics, not the mathematics as a group of objects of of math, but the working this that the Americans say that that working mathematician, and when he is in front of a bet, he must take a decision. Okay, I think this it's very close of what we have here in Lacan, like this declaration or a decision in front not of an object, a pure logical Freudian object, but it's an object like a humid object that flows through the time. I think it's I don't know if you know what I mean, but I see I see this I see these two perspectives very close. So at the time we extract one of these prisoners extract very curious extracts something of this time of excitation and by this uncertainty I don't say it's like you have some signs that points to you to take a decision. Okay, even if you don't know even if you don't know exactly what is the consequence.
Yes.
Like leap of faith in a way, right?
Yeah, it is something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for example, on the quantical physical, for example, okay, the physics of the
quantum physics.
Yeah, exactly. Well, become by arise this kind of physical arises from a problem, the catastrophe, the ultraviolet catastrophe. I think it's that's the name. When the scientists in front of a problem that was the calculations that the physicals was not enough to measure the ultraviolet radiation.
Yes.
Because they are like radiation, but have a behavior like a part like photons or
Yeah.
so Planck must take a decision, okay, to create a theorem, a mathematical theorem to explain, okay, how ultraviolet ray, for example, radiation behaves like a photon, so it's a decision. You must it's that point when mathematics must take a decision, must build a rule to formalize that problem.
Yes.
I don't know if the decision of the prisoners is on the same way. Is just to understand, because for me it's very close to this notion, okay, of a bet. Okay?
Yeah, I think there is something very close to what I like what you're saying, because it's you're faced with something that you don't understand, like in the mathematics of quantum physics, for example. You see something in an experiment and you can't you can't explain it with the mathematical tools that you already have, right? So you have to invent a new tool, right, to understand it. It's exactly like that, but the difference is, in this case, you have multiple individuals who have to compete with each other in a way and they are trapped together in the same problem. So there's an element of like the individual versus the collective.
Oh, okay.
That is an additional thing, you know, because in the case of Planck, right, who is working on quantum physics, or Heisenberg or Niels Bohr, these guys, they're part of the mathematical community, but they don't need to solve it at the same time that the others. There's no
Pressure, for example.
Yeah.
Like okay, that tension between the individuals.
Exactly, the tension of needing to decide now, along with other people. That's the additional thing that, and I think I didn't have time to go into it, but I think a very interesting text to consider is Freud's text on masses, the psychology of the mass, right? Because I think this is actually the kind of the background of everything here, which is how do we when you have a mass, right, which is like an unorganized group of individuals together, you start to see like basically they start to behave kind of like a child, right? You have like, you can put a lot of smart people together, but then if they're part of the mass, they won't behave very smart. They will behave like children, and basically a lot of the personality, the individual personality, disappears and is replaced by this like kind of general
Collective.
Mob mentality or general mentality, right? And then Freud tries to understand, why does this happen? What can we learn from this reduction of the individual? I think this is kind of the problem that instead of like quantum physics, it's like, why is it that these individuals start to behave like a collective, like a group? Yeah, but
Dennis, there is one thing that I got my attention. So there is also like a prerequisite that a prisoner, can only leave when he correctly decides what color is his disc, right?
Mm-hmm.
And who so the other prisoner B and C, they're going to attest to him. Who's going to be the authority, right? Authority to liberate him, to say yes, he can go.
Yeah. So actually, A is all three of them. They're actually all three A, B, and C are relative to the prisoner. So if like it's the prisoners are Anna, Dennis, and Max, A can be any one of us. And if A is Dennis, then B and C are Anna and Max. But A can also be Max. Then B and C would be Dennis and Anna, right? So A, B, and C are just the formal. They can rotate. It's not really fixed. So, but also, yeah. So all three of them are A. So all three of them, when they reach the door, they all say the same thing.
Yeah, and the other two can see, right? So that it's why. It's an interesting moment. I was thinking of escaped. So basically, in a way, yeah, three prisoners can leave, actually, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is
so
there?
yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's another important point. Is in the beginning I said only one prisoner can leave, which is the first prisoner to answer this. But the problem is all three of them walk together. So the rules of the game are kind of broken there, because what can the warden of the prison, what can they do if they see the three prisoners all walking together and they all say the same thing? Then how do they decide which one gets to leave? Lacan doesn't answer that problem, but
okay.
Right. Yeah, that is a feature of the problem. Yeah.
Okay, so we can say that, but then, for example, in this case, there is competition because each one of them, okay, it is a logical notion of collectivity, but there is a collectivity because, first of all of them know that they cannot lie. I mean, I cannot just say whatever without justification and leave. It's obvious what I'm saying. It's very different from, I even think the example that Max gave, of course, there is a hidden competition always. We always hear even from writers, oh, there is this group and I never know what the other two are writing, but they always come up, even Zizek himself says that about the Troika, yeah, that he doesn't know what, they always come up, Mladen Dolar and Alenka, right, with a wonderful text. And so it's always a surprise. And I think maybe he thinks about this work by Lacan when he says that, right? Okay, so who's got the white disc, right? Who writes better? But okay, but back to Max's example. So what Max, there is a competition, but on the other hand, they work for to solve the same problem. So there it would be, yes, there would be a demand to come up with a new theorem, right, or formula. But I think there is more, for me, there is more collectivity in that. And another thing, what they come up, even the theorem or formula, it can be, in a way, it can be proven wrong in the future. Right, because we know it happens sometimes, and okay, he uses this formula to describe, but like Fermat theorem, but someone in the future will prove right or wrong. But in this case, the case of prisoners, they know that they have to rely, in a way, their, how can I say, their freedom hinges on the wish for freedom of other two prisoners. So basically competing among themselves. At the same time, each one of them believes that only he or she can come to fruition of liberty. Because if this sophism would be, okay, only deciding, each one of you, right, deciding what color disc is yours, and then the three of you can walk out. You see? So for me, the problem here is a little bit, yes, it is a logical notion of collectivity, but only I can, and I know this from the very beginning. Even all the three start moving, the prerequisite for me to break free is that, it's like the premise was that only I can only one prisoner can leave, and we don't know what happens to the other three, because if it were okay, so you have to make this, there is the instance of the glance, and then you make these calculations, and then the three of you can leave. Then it would be like a real collectivity.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a very evocative, because if you think about the problems that we face today, things like, the environment, the commons of, Zizek has this 4 horsemen, right? Intellectual property, apartheid, biogenetics, and so on. You have these kind of common problems that face everybody, right? So in a lot of ways, we are like those prisoners, in the sense that we have an unspecified amount of time before these problems become, well, I mean, just right now, the virus is an example of a problem. We don't know how long it will last, right? And there's a kind of a falling behind that each one of us can experience. Like, are we, doing worse or better than the others around us? That's kind of the setting for this logic to appear. The setting is a common problem, and then an unspecified amount of time to solve it. But yeah, I have more to say on this, but I think we should finish just the last few slides and then maybe go back to this discussion. Yeah, because it's exactly what we're talking about here, which is, okay, I guess the first time I read this, and for a long time, I always thought, this is, like Alex was saying, like, how is this logic really working? Is it really logic, or is it some kind of trick that Lacan is playing? And I think the answer is kind of both. There is some magic happening. So, if you go to a mathematician and you present this logic to them, I'm not sure most mathematicians would say this is not really logic. Like, you're adding too much subjectivity, too much too much individuality or something into this problem for it to be logical, right? So, but I think we can say, like, that there's a certain class of problems that normal logic cannot really solve, which is, earlier I was talking about the economic view of human beings, right? The way that economics views human beings is, we do things based on self-interest, right? I do something because I get something, some benefit, let's say utility or happiness, right, from doing something. And that's what, and when presented with different choices, I will try to act to maximize my own personal happiness, right? That's the basic idea. And so you have this kind of framework in economics called game theory that creates these puzzles, these problems of what happens when you put multiple people together to in a game situation, and each individual in the game is trying to maximize their own personal gain. Then you have, for example, the classic prisoner's dilemma, where you have 2 prisoners, and if they cooperate, the 2 prisoners are in different rooms. That's an important part. They cannot communicate, just like the prisoners in this sophism. The prisoner's dilemma, the 2 prisoners are not allowed to communicate, and they are both given the chance to either basically give up the other one, and you get to go free, but the other person gets like 10 years in prison, right? Or if you both refuse to talk, that's actually the best for both, because if you both refuse to talk, then you both get to go free, let's say, or you both get a minimum sentence or something in prison or something like that. But the problem is, because I care about my own freedom, I'm going to give up my partner And then the partner will think the same thing. I will give up my partner. And then actually that's the worst situation, because if both people give up the other, then they both go to prison, right?
Yeah.
So this class of problem is, it's very common in it, because it's all about where the individual search for maximizing their pleasure, their utility, conflicts with the group. So I wanted to discuss that for the last 2 slides. There was a famous economist named Mansur Olson who wrote this book, Logic of Collective Action, where he studies this problem about groups. He says that he's talking about the problems around the collective good, and he defines collective good to be any good that if it's consumed by one person in the group, then it cannot be withheld from the others in the group. So imagine, for example, if I don't know, if we were all together and I paid for a movie I downloaded a movie and I put it on the TV. Well, I personally paid for the movie, but everyone in the room with me, if you are all in the room, then you could all watch the movie. I can't really take away that movie from any one of you, right? It's a collective good in that sense. Okay, but there's other examples like water, air, and so on. They're the things that you cannot restrict. So in this class of problem, or in this class of collective good, Mansur Olson discovered that we have a tendency to favor small groups over large groups, because in a small group, the reward, the collective good, is divided among a fewer number of people. Whereas in a larger group, the reward is divided amongst many more people, but also the costs are divided amongst many more people. So imagine the example where we have a park or some kind of common ground land for our neighbors, and we can enjoy it. We can take a walk through this park, or we can spend time with our family there outdoors. And each person, there's like thousands of people that can enjoy this park. The problem is that if a small group of people wanted to replace this park with if they wanted to drill for oil, or they wanted to put a shopping center to replace this park, those small group of people will stand to gain a lot more than the individuals gain from the park individually. Like, let's say you take a walk in the park once a week. So that might be worth a certain amount of money to you. Let's say it's worth, I don't know, some like $100 or something. It's worth $100 to you to be able to take a walk in the park once a week. But to these individuals that are drilling for oil, they stand to gain much, much more, because it's a smaller group of people. So their incentive to act is much greater than your incentive as a collective or as a group to protect that park.
Yeah.
Right. It's basically the issue that we talked about earlier about motivating people to engage in some kind of collective activity, because I do like walking in the park, but not that much that I would go and try to spend my time and effort to protect it. So because the cost of losing the park is divided amongst all of the members of the community, so it doesn't feel like a big loss, whereas it is a big gain for this small number of individuals. This is the basic paradox that Mansur Olson is trying to understand here. On top of this, there's what he calls the free rider problem. That's a different problem, but it's related. It's basically saying whenever there is some kind of fight for the park, let's say you and I really like the park, so we decide to stage a sit-in or a strike to block the developers from destroying the park. The problem is we can't get anyone else to join us because their rationale is, if I don't do anything, Anna and Dennis will still try to stop this project. So if they succeed, I get the benefit. I can still go to the park. But if they don't succeed, it's okay because I don't, I didn't have to go and do anything, right? So they free ride in the sense that they benefit from the effort of the few engaged people within the community without having to contribute anything. So that's that problem, and so that this is the this is where the logic of collectivity from the economic standpoint is limited, right? It doesn't have the tools to describe collective action, like joining together to stop a park, or in the case of this virus, staying at home to protect the those with compromised immune systems and so on. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, the last slide is just a nice case study of this, where earlier I was talking about this Taft-Hartley Act. There was a strike wave in 45 and 46 right after the war, and they tried to limit the power of unions. But they found while they were trying to pass this law, they discovered that when it comes to unions, over 90% will not attend the meetings or participate in the union. So it's very low participation. But over 90% will vote to force themselves to belong to the union and make payments to it. This is a really important point, I think, because it's saying that even though the individual incentive to be a part of the union is very small, I don't really want to spend time to go to the union and to participate. It is in my benefit to force myself and everyone else to be a part of the union. Yeah, and this is recognized. This is experimentally verified that people understand. Same thing with taxes. As an individual, I don't like to pay tax. If I can avoid paying tax or pay less tax, I'll probably, take those steps. If, for example, I talk to an accountant or something to lower my taxes, that's common. Everyone, a lot of people do that. They go and try to lower their individual tax. But if you were to ask them, oh, should we get rid of taxes, make all taxes zero? Most people would say no, right? Because they recognize that it's beneficial if everyone pays some tax. So there's a contradiction between the individual utility maximization on the one hand and the global participation on the other hand. Yeah, and that's pretty much it for this. I mean, I just wanted to kind of draw that connection between these problems from the economic standpoint and the logic of basically psychoanalysis that Lacan introduces.
Very good. Very good.
I would like to to relate this material, Dennis. I don't know if it's possible if you would share with us on the reference or something.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I'll send everything after the meeting. I can probably upload it to to Facebook or like Google or something.
Dennis also mentioned that work by Dion, that is
Yeah, beyond.
about war, right?
Yes.
That would be
Yeah.
also interesting. Um, you know, guys, I was thinking on, of course, as usual, on a lighter note, what's the logic? Some joke that Zizek uses quite often in his speeches, and um, the logic of the Slovenian farmer. And God asks Slovenian farmer, whatever you decide, I'll give double to your neighbor. And what Slovenian farmer says, take away my eye.
Yeah.
There is this logic too. So
Yeah.
I thought like, Dennis was, but Zizek, that's why, you know, he calls the shots when he says that it seems that it's Slovenian farmers are like that. But of course, when we speak about the cooperation, right, and the way that we collectively, I still think I'll probably think a wonderful presentation, Dennis. By the way, I'll think for days now about the prisoners because you made it really clear what's what's at work there, and that they really actually to be able to enjoy the personal gain, they basically each one of them has to count with the decency of the other in a way, but decency, of course, dictated by the situation, because there is this prerequisite. There is no political game. They have to be. It has to be a truthful decision in a way, right? So, yeah, we could also think about it, because it is very. I think Lacan has some point here that there is this. I count, even taking all this time into consideration, I still have to, in a way, willy-nilly maybe, but I have to count on the other two prisoners.
Yes, exactly. The other two prisoners have to walk with me. They have to confirm my assertion. Yeah. So there's this, kind of, it's a kind of a positive relationship, right? But I think your joke that you said with the farmer is also interesting. I think it's like this logic of collectivity is not necessarily a good thing. It could possibly be like it could capture some like a bad kind of collectivity as well, I think, based on envy or something like that. But I think logically there's something similar in both cases.
And now, guys, that every one of us is in quarantine, basically, in a way, we're following this logic, because at least in the West, differently from India, for example, when it's imposed, we're home out of our volition in a way. Yeah, okay, businesses are closed and some of us work from home, but why do we do this? Exactly to flatten the curve, to so that hundreds of unknown, thousands of unknown elderly people and people with weakened or with biased immune response, right, can have a chance of getting their ventilators because it's not if, it's basically when. It seems that 70% of us will have to catch the virus, right? To create the immune response, this herd, right? Immunity. And so we're doing this in a way, in a collective logic, not of the farmer, at least, right? Because if I stay home, of course, it's not to catch a virus myself, but in a way, especially we're not, at least, right, in the risk group. And for me, it's thinking of those other hundreds of elderly people or working people who might have a chance, right, at getting their ventilator when they need it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point with the virus. I think that's exactly a collective problem, right? Because it's also unspecified. There's a lot of uncertainty with the virus. We don't know how long it will last. We don't know what are the best measures to take. But we do know that, yeah, a large group of people are endangered, and that there needs to be some kind of joint effort, because if only a small number of people break the quarantine, then it kind of loses the value. Yeah, exactly. The value of the quarantine drops.
I arrived here late, but I'm trying to put a question. Seems to this logic of Lacanian group, this works only if you have a kind of common goal, common aim. So if the prisoners are trying to escape, for this they engage in a collective process. But not ever you have some collective recompense, collective gains.
Reward, yeah, collective reward.
Collective awards, yeah, collective awards. If you engage in this practice, and sometimes you have something like capitalism that's engaging in your own activity, engaging in your own individual process. You seem to contribute to global aim, I don't put benefits, but global results. So it seems to me that the logic of Lacanian group, that's a logic that you engage in a collective process for maybe an individual or collective award, don't seem to operate very good to some capitalism. You can hear me?
Yes, Philip, I think exactly that's the point. So that would be the joke of the Slovenian farmer, right? Because it's usually, if I get an eye, so right, so my neighbor is basically my my adversary, right? And so for me, it's better when my neighbor goes about blind. So I will get in a land of eyeless, eye with one eye, I can get ahead. You see? And of course, there is, the God said, whatever you get, your neighbor gets twice as much. Yeah, there is this. But for example, if I don't have a car, why would I not ask for a car? Yeah, because my neighbor gets two. So, and the logic of capitalism is not this.
Yeah, and if you have something like John Nash theory, game theory, you have you have this more elaborated, more accurate view about the collective process, because what I am talking here is about you have individual engagements producing unexpected global results by the competition, and by other side you have I imagine the example of the park that Dennis give. You have some group award, but most of times you don't have any motivation to engage yourself in a group organization.
Yeah, this is the problem. Yeah, I think the economic view, which is based on game theory, cannot explain why people would try to save the park, because, well, they kind of have a way, but it's not a very good explanation, because they think it's because each individual must have some incentive, so that each individual gains some amount of personal satisfaction or something in order to motivate them to try to protect a park or some kind of collective good, right? But I think there's something more happening when people come together to do these things, especially when it's like a forced choice situation, situations of where there's limited time and something needs to happen. It's not always, we don't always have a time to know what is going to be the best for us personally. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense, right? It's not like the prisoners had enough time to say, oh, well, do I really want to leave the prison, or like what action is going to give me personally the best output in this case, right? In normal conditions, you're right. I think in normal, when there's no problem and you're just choosing, like in the supermarket, between, do I want these apples or do I want this coffee here, and I have money, then the economic explanation works. But in a situation, for example, climate change, if the weather is changing and you have warming, and you have different kind of disasters happening, at that moment you don't have time and you don't have the tools to measure satisfaction, if that makes sense. And I think that's where the economic model of behavior starts to break down, because we don't act according to that simple method. Yeah.
And there is another thing, I absolutely agree, Dennis. It's exactly also a little bit I already mentioned, but again, so this is the logic of for us to stay at home. Basically, we're harming ourselves economically in a way, right? So this is something, maybe nothing will happen after the end of the pandemic, because it's still just the beginnings. But we can also start thinking about this way, because now that we stay home, basically we go against, and it's in a way even in a way harmful, right? Because we do not exercise, we do not go to the places we usually go, we do not do the activities, especially like in the open air, that we like. But most people, if it hadn't been for this economic, they would say, or immediate harm, they would say, okay, so I stay home because I really have the understanding, I want to flatten the curve. And another thing, but it just to prove what you said, Dennis, is that when you were presenting the work of Bion, what caught my attention when Lacan also went to, let's not forget, those are the soldiers with the common trauma, right? They had seen what it is when there is no collective, and I mean the groups, and you see the prerequisite is like no one is left behind. So everyone has, Bion made it a point to involve, right, everyone in the group. He was not punishing the shirkers. I remember in your presentation, right? But everyone has, if you don't like all the other groups, you still have to come up with your own, even if there are 2 or 3 members. And the wonderful thing is that so the result of the experiment is that they not only started and embarked on the groups, working with the groups, they also started doing it over and beyond their free time. So it in a way, like coming from trauma, right, from traumatic background, but it also allowed them to, in this, to find this modicum of meaning, right, of their post-traumatic life and experiences.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, the wartime example is a nice one where you don't have time to measure like what's going to give me individual satisfaction because you're in the middle of a war, and there's you know, these kinds of events where let's say the entire world, or your entire world at least, has kind of fallen apart. Then the model of economics is not I don't think it's the best model for and no wonder then also for psychoanalysis, it's usually people go to psychoanalysis because in some sense their world is falling apart. It's not a normal time, and the normal rules of economic gain, you know, personal satisfaction doesn't really apply.
Yeah. See, right. Very good. Wonderful.
Yep. So yeah, that's it for the presentation. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis, so much. Enjoyed.
Thank you, my comrade.
Thank you, Dennis. Look, dude, before you leave, can I make a question?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions you guys have? Sorry, I didn't ask for more.
I'm good.
Okay. So you said, I think it's on the page 27 that Lacan wrote, the collective is nothing but the subject of the individual.
Yes.
Right?
Uh-huh.
And I didn't get this line like right, and I would like you to explain this line better. And I don't know if you can like link this line here with the idea that Freud had or tried to explain from that mob, like mass conscience that kind of, I don't know, but kind of opposes to this collective that has this subject arising, something like that.
Yeah, good question. I can partially answer that. I think so collectivity and the subject. For example, we normally think that the subject is the one who acts, right? The one who's the making the decision, or the somehow driving the movement of something in some way. So in the case of this prisoners, in case of the 3 prisoners trying to leave the prison, it's not actually any of the individual prisoners who are making any decisions. They're acting out of necessity. Each individual there is just acting out of desperation. Even it's not because they are it's not because they're sure of themselves, and no one is really in control of the solution, right? The solution comes when all 3 of them act out of necessity. So the collectivity, when we say the subject is the collective, we're saying that the one who is solving the problem is not at the individual level, it's at the level of the group, right?
So the mob would be like when the individuals are thinking each one for themselves. And
yes, when the individuals are thinking for themselves, they cannot solve the problem.
Yeah.
It can only solve the problem when they're not thinking just for themselves, but also there's this other element. I mean, in some sense, they are thinking for themselves because each one of them wants to leave the prison. You know, I'm not saying like they're not selfish and they're not somehow they're better. You know, like they can be bad people, but the point of the collectivity is that there's another element that is required to solve the puzzle. You need a fourth entity, not A, B, or C, but something like all three of them together counts as its own character, let's say, its own person. And that's the subject. And so I think that's what Lacan means there. There's an additional element in the problem.
Okay, right.
And then your second question about Freud. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to go back and try to understand what he's saying in that book, The Mass Psychology. But I think, yeah, again, he's talking about also another element that appears besides individuals, right? You bring a lot of individuals together, and it's as if another creature, another thinking being appears there. That's not any of the individuals themselves. So he's studying like a basic form of this, but it's not a positive thing, right? Masses can be very destructive and very stupid. Yeah. So it's another side of the problem.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, comrades.
Close the necrology.
All right.